Good morning. Good morning. I am at home today. Good morning. Oh, let's see. I am going to invest in um, I'm going to invest in a stand. What you hear playing in the background is Location by, I don't know, Khalid. I don't know how to pronounce his name. So, I wanted to, good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Reverend L of Will You Behold Ministries. I am, many of y'all know me as Lisette. And so I am coming on today and have started this Wrestle with It Wednesday, right? So my work with Will You Be Whole is about talking sex and faith for Black women and those who love them. And one of the things that my work has taught me is that we are wrestling with who we are as sexual beings, and we are also wrestling with who we are as spiritual beings, right? So persons who enjoy sex, want to enjoy sex, love our bodies, and then who are also Christians, are spiritual, or who have a belief system that has communicated some sex negative messages. And we're striving to be, right, both sexually faithful and faithfully sexual. That's my t-shirt, hyping out my t-shirts. They are on sale. I'm placing an order for, my first order was women's shirts. And so I'm waiting for a couple of other folks to let me know that they want some so I can place a second order for men's shirts. And they are $20. So that's my effort of kind of getting this message out there of what it means to be whole. So Will You Be Whole is all about equipping us with the information, the inspiration to be able to reconcile who we are as both sexual and spiritual beings, right? So today, this Wednesday, the second time I'm doing it. Last Wednesday I was in New Orleans. I had a wonderful view of the Mississippi River, getting ready for the Let's Talk About Sex conference, where I did a workshop on I Love God and Sex Too, redefining our sexual ethic. And so one of the things that came up in that conference was this idea that the church always tells us no about anything related to sex or related to our bodies and sexuality. So if the church is constantly telling us no, what should we be saying yes to, right? And my question for us to wrestle with today is what role, what responsibility does the church have in us saying yes to sexuality, right? And so let me put some terms, some defining terms and parameters out there so that you know what I mean when I use the word sexuality, and you know what I mean when I use the word spirituality or faith. So number one, sexuality. When I am talking about sexuality, I am referring to three specific areas. One is our sexual activity. So what are we doing with our bodies? What are we doing? Who are we doing that activity with? The second thing is our sexual expression, how we're showing up in the world, how are we being our sexual selves, and then our identity. Who do you identify as? Who do we identify as? And that is our gender identity, that is our sexual orientation, that is that sense of self, who we are as even a sexual person, because some of us are a little flirty, and some of us are conservative, and some of us embrace and are bold in showing our bodies and being out there fully without any reservation, right? So sexuality is complex and complicated. And using those three areas, sexual activity, sexual identity, and sexual expression, is often how I employ and use the word sexuality. Spirituality. So I define spirituality as the process of connecting to that which is greater than ourselves, right? So for me, that comes through in three areas. Number one, spirituality is this grander process of connecting to that which is bigger than ourselves. But spirituality for me is specifically about Christianity. So Christianity is the pathway that I choose to employ my spirituality. And by Christianity, I mean the faith system, the religion that is based on confession of Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. That is how I define and operate in Christianity. And then the last thing is faith, right? I use the word faith, and when I use that word, I am referring to the set of beliefs that govern how you live. All right, so I have grounded us in what is sexuality. I've grounded us in how I use spirituality. And now I want us to wrestle with, what is the church? What is the church role or responsibility in helping us say yes to sexuality, right? And I know that there are lots of opinions out there about what the church has said. There are lots of thoughts and ideas about the role of the church in our personal lives. And so I understand that for some of us, the church has been a place of support and encouragement. It has been a place of defining and of grounding, right? And for many of us, the church has also been a place of hurt, of deep pain, and causes us to wrestle with the utility, right? The purpose of why do we keep going to church when we've either been hurt or when the church doesn't accept fully who we are, or even the church has dealt us some lies and some stories, some myths that have not been helpful in us learning who we are as sexual persons, right? So I recognize the church is, let's just say it, the church is problematic. We love the church. I love the church. And when you love someone or something, you are willing to wrestle with it, and you are always seeking its virtue. So we know that the common narrative or myth is that the church tells us to say no to sex. No, no, no. Don't have it. Don't do it. The only way to have it is within a proper marriage, which traditionally, biblically, literally is identified as a man and a woman, right? So that means no same-gender marriages, no same-gender couplings, no polyamory, right? And sometimes, no sense of being asexual. And asexual just simply means someone who does not have sexual attractions. So we understand some of the most conservative, sex-negative messages and theologies have come out of the church. So then the wrestle for me, and I'm inviting you to wrestle with, is then what responsibility or what role does the church have in helping us say yes? Why should the church be invested in our sexual wholeness? I don't know if I have a direct answer to that, and I invite you to wrestle with it, even as I wrestle with it. I see that the church has been such an integral place in my life in defining who I am as a woman, and even how I understand my sense in the world. But what the church hasn't given me space to do is to wrestle with my sexuality, right? So today is National Coming Out Day, and so that is time and opportunity for people who are within the LGBTQ community to boldly say who they are, who they love, stand fully in their truth. And so I think about the ways that the church hasn't always been supportive or present in that process, right? How has the church helped me say yes to my sexual identity or my sexual orientation as bisexual? Problematic. I understand that, right? So what I'm asking and I'm inviting us to wrestle with is, we know the church has said no. We often say in our Facebook conversations, in our classrooms, or in conversations with our good friends, we often say, well, the church should say, help us say yes to sex and help us say yes to sexuality. The church should be teaching us about our bodies and should be giving us a sex positive theology that allows us to wrestle with this flesh that we're given, right? And so then for me, the wrestle is then where is the responsibility? Where does this responsibility land with the church? What does the church have to do with who we are as sexual beings? And I'm posing that as a question to wrestle with, right? Good morning, Cheesy. And so I don't have an exact answer. I have some suggestions. Of course, I have some suggestions, but I still wrestle with, right, this idea that we place the responsibility on the church, on teachings of the church, to help us say yes to sex, help us say yes to our sexual expression, sexual identity, help us to deal with, good morning, Reverend Pastor. I don't know if I'm the doctor, you the doctor. Good to see you, Dorian. But the church, right? So those of us who are, so I'm a pastor, and those of us who are pastors, or those of us who are in church and have roles of leadership within the church, what does the church, what role does the church have and play in us defining and saying yes to our sexuality? Is it Bible studies? Is it sermons? Is it groups? Right? Is it how you have the singles ministry? Good morning, Robin. You had a singles ministry, and they always, in traditional. I can only talk about my context. In traditional Black Baptist context, that's what I was formed and raised in. The singles ministry is where you talked about it, right? All right, Kyle, how you doing, Kyle? And so, but even singles ministry didn't ever really talk about how to manage our sexuality, our sexual desires, the idea of sexual pleasure. So what responsibility does the church have with that? So Kyle is suggesting that it's Christocentric and sex positive, right? So I did, the beauty of being a pastor, right, is that I get to push the envelope a little bit. And so I hosted a panel on sex positivity and spirituality. And one of the questions that came up that I'm posing out there for y'all and for us to wrestle with is, what is sex positive? What does it mean to be sex positive? And in our definition of being sex positive, what responsibility or what considerations do we have for individuals that truly do believe that being abstinent, that being celibate is part of their relationship with God? So let's unpack a couple of things. Number one of the things that we haven't necessarily named in this conversation, or I haven't named rather, is that I'm using the language of church. And we understand, or I will say, most typically we understand church to be a organization that is based on a particular structure, and that structure then decides how it wants to live out its theology and all of that stuff, right? So I'm using the word church, but I'm not taking into consideration what is your relationship? What is our relationship with God? And how the church is most likely expected to be that place where we can work out our relationship with God. So wrestling with church permission also means helping us to define what are the boundaries that the church has in even allowing us or directing us to reflect on our personal relationship with God. So being sex positive has to relate to what it means to holistically and fully understand who you are, how you engage, what your body is willing to do, right? How you then live that out, right, in what I would call ethical ways. So we want the church to tell us to say yes to sex. And we want the church to be able to give us space. But how much responsibility should the church have with that? And I keep going back to that question because we are the church. And if we are the church and we also identify as sexual and we are wrestling with our bodies, we are figuring out how we want to have sex, who we want to have sex with, whether we want to have sex, what that looks like. We're figuring out our bodies. We're figuring out relationships and how that works out, right? And so we're going through that process, and we look to the church for guidance. And so I suggest that the church, at minimum, should be a space where we can wrestle with this stuff. The church should be a space where we can pull out the scriptures, where we can pull out our theologies, and we can put them in conversation with our practical living. That in fact, this what I call the journey to wholeness, what I call defining our sexual ethic, is actually a process of discernment. And that the church, as our space of spiritual connection, spiritual community, should give us the opportunity to wrestle with that, right? And I believe that the church has a responsibility in saying, you know what? This is how we look at the scripture. This is how we understand the theology that we live out based on our biblical interpretation. Now, I'm throwing out these words around theology and biblical interpretation and all of those stuff, but the bottom line comes back to, right? If the church has consistently said no, what is a church? How does the church now say yes? And what is the church helping us say yes to? Now, I don't have an answer. That's why this is called Wrestle with It Wednesday. It's not called Define It Wednesday or Here's Your Answer Wednesday. And so I invite you to continue that conversation, right? That in your faith communities where you worship, or even in the spiritual communities where you find connection, how are you working out the fullness of who you are? Your body, your identity, your expression, the activity, the joy and pleasure of sex, the embracing that God created sex for a good thing, for us to relate in positive ways to each other, that we are working against the oppressive systems that we live in that cause us to see sex as negative, that cause us to have to deal with the violence that comes with the abuse of power, particularly the abuse of sexual power. And we recognize that in this month, October, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so even this idea of honoring our bodies while we are healing from sexual trauma, while we're healing from violations in our bodies, also means the church has a responsibility to hold space for us, to hold space to reconcile that deep pain that comes when our body is sexually violated. So this becomes a deeper conversation, right? More so than just, okay, the church needs to tell us to say yes to everything related to sex. No, it needs to be a nuanced conversation that allows the church to meet us where we are. And even as we are being met where we are with the church, we are then invited to shape the church even as the church is shaping us. And let me remind, folks that are watching now or that may watch this later, that when I use the word church, I am also meaning spiritual communities that may not be according to traditional church. Anytime you are in space together and you're willing to talk about those things that allow us to connect to that which is bigger than ourselves, you are engaged in spiritual community, in faith community, right? And that we cannot continue to separate who we are as sexual beings from who we are as spiritual beings. So I think that I have, or at least I feel good about some of the things we've wrestled with today. One of the things that I'm figuring out, and I invite your feedback, definitely invite your feedback anyway, I invite your feedback because my vision of doing Wrestle With It Wednesday is for, number one, me to share some thought-provoking topics for us to wrestle with, but also for us to be in dialogue. So I'm always willing and open to be in conversation because we're all wrestling to determine what it means for us to be sexually whole, for us to love God and love sex too, for us to be to live fully as our authentic self, as individuals created with the imago Dei, the image of God imprinted on our very being, for us to live into the full pleasure of what it means to be sexual. And if you're not having good sex, I believe that is a sin. I might get some pushback on that, and that's fine. But good sex, I believe, is what God has called and created, what the divine, the creator, wants us to engage in. And what we've got to wrestle with are what we believe, our faith system, what our church says, what religion has taught us, and who we are as sexual persons. Owning our sexuality, being okay loving sex, because I love sex, right? But I don't take that as my laissez-faire attitude toward living a life with a grounded sexual ethic. I love God and I love sex too. Does not automatically mean I'm out here all willy-nilly slanging my goodness around. That's not what it's about, right? It's about the work of discerning. It's about the work of wrestling. It's about the work of not only asking the hard questions, but also defining for yourself. If the church never makes a change, if the church continues to tell us that sex is bad, that your body is bad, that pleasure is bad, what are you going to do? That's a whole nother Wrestle With It Wednesday. The choices that people have made. Because I know plenty of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex individuals that have not come back to the church because the church has told them that who they are is bad. I know folks who are survivors of rape and survivors of sexual violence who will not come back to the church because of the judgment and the conservative theologies that don't give space for healing and for reclamation of who we are. You are welcome, Pastor Daniels. And so, if we indeed are going to be, as my shirt says, sexually faithful and faithfully sexual, then we are going to have to wrestle with these things. And because Pastor Daniels, my good seminary colleague, Dorian, has posed that, let me just put this challenge. Let me put this challenge out to pastors and to clergy and ministers, youth ministers, and dare I say lay leaders, right? Is you get to shape the church, and you have a responsibility to lead people through the change process of letting go of these conservative, body negating, sex negative theologies that are holding us hostage from our healing and our wholeness. I'm not telling you how to do it. You got to work out your soul salvation and your theology with God and the scriptures and some good textbooks, some sources. But it is our responsibility as pastors and as religious leaders to lead the people, to hold space with the people. This is a whole nother wrestle with it. But I just feel the Spirit. For me, I feel the Spirit simply saying in this moment, do not forget the responsibility we have to not only lead people to heaven, which is problematic on a whole lot of ways, but whatever, lead people to the spiritual sense, but also give people space and tools and opportunity to wrestle with who we are now, with this bodies that we're in now, with this amazing, glorious flesh that God crafted in our mother's wombs. Yes, Kyle, have good sex. But holiness is yet right. Sex positive holiness. Now listen, Kyle, you can't. You're not gonna come and start troubling the waters as I'm trying to close. But hashtag sexual ethic. You are right. I think that we need to talk about sex positive holiness. Because on a whole nother Facebook live situation, I will share my traumatic experience being a sex positive pastor on a holiness panel. And so we've got to wrestle with what holiness is. But that's another topic for another day, Reverend Kyle. I appreciate you bringing that up. I appreciate you, Dorian, for remembering and acknowledging that as a pastor we have challenges, right? We are challenged to be able to push beyond what we have either been trained or brought up, and walk into and live into our role as actual shepherds, right? And be able to shepherd the people through their sexual journey, their sexual and spiritual journey. Stop expecting folks to leave their sex at the door. Anyway, I'm going off on another tangent. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say thank you for joining me for this Wrestle With It Wednesday. I think that we are going to talk a little bit about sex positive holiness, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the church, right, how religion has subconsciously caused us to leave our sex at the door. Leave who we are as sexual persons at the door. And is that fully honoring a God that created you as a whole person? Does God really only want parts of you, or does God want all of you? That's another wrestle with it for another day. Thank you so much for joining me here on Wrestle With It Wednesday. I am Reverend L. Many of y'all know me as Lisette Cross. Reverend L is just, it is my Will You Be Whole moment and role that I played to talk about sex and faith, for wholeness, for us to wrestle with who we are. And here I am plugging the t-shirt again, right? Sexually faithful, faithfully sexual, moving us through that process. If you are in any way encouraged and benefited from this, I appreciate your support and invite you to come back next Wednesday. Be sure to like my Facebook page, which is Will You Be Whole Ministries. I do the Facebook Live on my personal page so people know about it, but I also invite you to like Will You Be Whole Ministries. Thank you, Robin, for joining. Thank you, everyone that has joined and chimed in, and I look forward to next week. And it may be that we talk a little bit about what does it mean to be sex positive, what does it mean to be holy, because defining our sexual ethic is important in this process of becoming sexually faithful and faithfully sexual. So have an amazing day. Be sure to check me out or follow me on Will You Be Whole. Today is National Coming Out Day, so shout out to all of the courageous, amazing LGBTQ folks who boldly proclaim who we are. And we send love to all of the men, women, girls, boys, individuals who are not yet ready to be out because of what the church has said, because of what their families believe, because of what the church has said. And let us become people of faith that really do exemplify the love of God by being open and accepting and creating space for people to be their full, authentic self. Have an awesome day, and I will see y'all next week where we will wrestle with it. Thanks. Bye.